Well, we're coming together once again to look at 2 Corinthians and some of the commands found in this wonderful epistle. This is Paul's most personal letter. He is writing to these folks who are really challenging him and questioning him in many ways. And one of the ways that they were questioning him and challenging him had to do with his ministry to them. Now, keep in mind that Paul had founded this church. He was their spiritual father. He had brought most of these folks to Christ. He had even baptized some of them, although in chapter 1 of 1 Corinthians, he said he didn't baptize a lot. Apparently other people did. But nevertheless, he was their father, spiritually speaking. And yet, as they began to grow up, get more mature, more knowledge, more wisdom, hopefully at least wisdom is in what they thought was wisdom, they began to buck against Paul, challenge Paul, question Paul, and that's part of what this second letter is all about. In chapter 10, we pick up a third command this week, and the command is going to be a very simple one. Verse 17, it says, "But he who boasts is to boast in the Lord." And that's a very straightforward command. If you're going to brag about anything, brag about the Lord, not yourself. So that is a simple command to understand, and really not a difficult one to know how to obey, at least to put it on paper. Now, doing that may not always be easy. We often think very highly of ourselves. We are arrogant by nature. We're proud by nature, and so we like to talk about ourselves and think highly of ourselves. So applying this may be more difficult than understanding it. But the understanding is pretty clear. He who boasts is to boast in the Lord. But let's get a little context here. What exactly is Paul concerned about? I love chapter 10, verse 5. It says this, as we tear down speculations and every lofty thing raised up against the knowledge of God, and take every thought captive to the obedience of Christ. This verse is kind of summarizes much of what else is going on in this particular chapter. And even going back to the first epistle, we find that these people had really fallen in love with wisdom, but not God's wisdom necessarily, more of the Greek wisdom that was filling that society at the time. The Greeks loved wisdom. They liked it. They had philosophers like Plato and Aristotle and Socrates. These people were impressive to them, and they liked to get together at Athens, for example, and talk about all these kinds of things, and look at philosophies and look at religions and look at mysteries. This was just part of their culture, and so they loved to get together and talk about philosophy, and there's a place for that. But philosophy that isn't coming from the Word of God is a human philosophy filled with the wisdom of people. And when that wisdom and that philosophy begins to challenge or supplement or supplant the wisdom of God, we've got a problem. And this seems to be the context of what Paul's talking about here. These people were impressed with their own knowledge and wisdom, and they think they had outgrown Paul. And so they challenge whether or not he is even the one they ought to be following. And they were now comparing themselves with other people. Look at verse 12. "For we do not dare to classify or compare ourselves with some of those who commend themselves. But when they measure themselves by themselves and compare themselves with themselves, they're without understanding." So we have a competitive nature going on here. If there was a number of philosophers, they were pitting their philosophy against one another. And some were claiming the high road, and others were challenging that, and so they were debating these various issues. When it came to the Apostle Paul, they didn't turn their guns on him and began to say, well, his philosophy is one. It's a philosophy or theology he brought to us, but maybe it isn't the best. And we're going to compare his philosophy with our best philosophers. We know back in chapter 1 and 2 of 1 Corinthians, they were talking about the Christian leaders, Apollos and Peter and Paul, and they were comparing those theologies. They seemed to like to do that, and so much so that they began to elevate themselves above their leaders. And Paul, who had been their spiritual father, was in their sights at this time. And so Paul is reminding them, look, if you're comparing yourself with one another, that's not wise. We're not in a competition here. We're not seeing whose philosophy is better than the others. We're turning to the Word of God to see what the God has to say, and that's what's important. So when we come to the command of verse 17, we see the context. But he who boasts is to boast in the Lord. If we want to have a philosophy that is superior, that we can boast in, that we can brag about, it should be the Lord's, not ours. Boast in Him, not in self, and not in our wisdom, but in God's. That's his point that he's making to these people at this time. They had missed that point, and that has been a great detriment to this church. Tomorrow we'll look at yet another of these commands in 2 Corinthians.